16 December 1944. Street Vith sector, Ardennes, Belgium. In the fir trees above a frozen road, a German reconnaissance team huddles around a short mast and a pair of headphones. Fifth Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel is pushing west. Panzer Lehr Division under General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein and the 116th Panzer Division thread through the snow. Across the valley, the American First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges holds on with the 7th Armored Division and scattered Sherman companies. The Germans expect cut wires confusion and the old American stutter when orders die on roadside poles. The headset cracks alive with clean FM. No stories, no chatter, just clipped procedure. Identify. A beat. Acquire. Another beat. Fire. Sherman crews speak through SCR 508 sets. Infantry squads answer on SCR 300. The phrases dovetailing like cogs. Someone calls smoke. Another voice counts down a shift. Far behind the ridge, a battery answers with the dull, spaced thuds of guns firing a corrected mission. Snow shakes from branches. The German operator raises a finger for silence that no one breaks. They had counted on cut landlines and jamming to pry the American front apart. Instead, the net holds like a spine. Engines rise, then flatten as tanks relocate on command. The cadence the same on every transmission, short, cold, sufficient. A platoon reports a roadblock. A company acknowledges. A forward observer folds into the same rhythm and drags the fall of shot across a hedgerow with 2 numbers and 1 word. The air is so clear the squelched tails feel like doors closing. A second ridge, a second pattern. Another net requests a left shift and illumination. The rounds walk in within a minute. The German listener's pencil stops mid-stroke. He is hearing not a dozen voices, but one machine speaking through a dozen mouths. Metal contracts in the cold. The last shell lands and does not echo. Engines idle somewhere unseen. The FM net clicks once, twice, then stills. In the trees, the antenna trembles with wind alone, and the reconnaissance team stares across a white valley, where the only sound left is snow settling on the headset cable. By the 3rd week of December, 1944, the Ardennes was a map of frozen roads and blind hills, where command lived or died by voice. The Fifth Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel drove west toward the muse-throwing Volksgrenadier infantry and armour through the Street Vith Amblève corridors. North of the Schnee Eifel, the LVII Panzer Corps under General Walter Kruger pressed the ridgelines with the 116th Panzer Division, while Panzer Lehr Division under General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein probed along parallel roads. Across them, the American First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, tried to keep a line in motion rather than a line on paper. 8 Corps, under Major General Troy Middleton, had to hold the junctions long enough to reform a defence at Street. Vith, the 7th Armoured Division under Major General Robert W. Hasbrouck, with Combat Command B, led by Brigadier General Bruce C. Clark, became the hinge. The German opening aimed at familiar weak points, cut landlines, jam nets, and force the Americans to fight as scattered pieces. Weather closed the ceiling and caught the fighter bombers on the ground. The roads were too slick for fast redeployments. Telephone cables ran in shallow ditches the assault troops could lift with a boot. Under those conditions, a staff expects headquarters to go mute and local commanders to improvise alone. German radio intelligence teams pushed forward with the leading battalions, listened for that vacuum, and for the panic that follows it. What they found instead explained why the shelling in the cold open arrived as if pulled by a wire. The Americans had built their day of battle control around VHF FM. Infantry squads carried SCR 300 sets. Tanks spoke on SCR 508. Forward observers bridged to artillery and then back to armour without touching a single pole. The language was short and standardised. The net discipline tight enough that a lost set could be replaced without changing the rhythm. When the wire cutters did their work and the jammers scratched at the ether, the cadence on FM stayed. Identify, acquire, fire, shift. The loop from first report to corrected fire was measured in minutes and then repeated until an avenue of advance no longer existed. This mattered because of where the pressure concentrated. Street Vith was not only a town, it was a road problem, a knot of junctions that governed movement toward the west. If it failed quickly, the routes around Bastogne would open wider, and the timetable to the Meuse would shorten. With the weather suppressing air power, the ground fight had to close its own loop, scout to gun to maneuver to fresh observation. In that loop, the radios were not just convenience equipment, they were the spine that let battalions act like parts of a single body when the sky could not speak. German confidence in the traditional script had logic. In earlier campaigns, cutting wires and overrunning switchboards produced silence and then piecemeal resistance. In the first hours of the Ardennes attack, the assaults did break multiple command posts and ruptured telephone grids, but the forward American units did not fall into conversational chaos. They fell back on procedure. Brevity codes and net structures were already taught, so a rifle company and a tank troop that had never met could still trade the correct phrases and build a fire mission. When one frequency drew attention, operators shifted nets and carried on. The content did not grow heroic. It stayed narrow, a roadblock here, a bearing there, smoke on request traverse left 2 mills. The ordnance followed. The cost of this for the attacker was time. A panzer battalion could force a gap, but the gap filled with directed artillery before the 2nd Company cleared the choke point. A reconnaissance company could nose around a flank, but the tanks on the other side were not isolated vehicles. They were a distribution of guns, cued by voices that never had to travel on a wire. The more often German scouts intercepted that cadence, the less the battle looked like many small fights, and the more it looked like one opponent with many hands. The American side was not fresher or stronger everywhere. Units were tired, some green, many dislocated by the surprise. But their communications architecture converted fatigue into predictability. It allowed commanders to strip pieces from one sector and have them arrive already speaking the same language. It also imposed a ceiling on improvisation. The voices stayed cold, the phrases impersonal, the actions bounded by standard operating procedure. In a winter campaign that punished delay, that impersonality became an advantage. The stakes were simple. If the FM framework failed, through capture of key sets, through persistent jamming, through breakdown of discipline street, Vith could unravel, and with it the ability to slow the armoured thrusts while reserves assembled. That would buy Germany weeks, perhaps months, and a different bargaining position. If the framework held, each German success at the tactical edge would meet a response guided by a net that could not be cut with pliers. The myth that American control could be severed by destroying its telephones would not survive the week. That is why the quiet after the fire missions mattered. It was not calm. It was the absence of waste in a system that still functioned. The German operators heard it, wrote it down, and passed it back. What stood in front of them at Street Vith and along the Amblève was not a set of isolated companies. It was a unified machine made from radios, drills, and enough replacement parts to keep the pattern running as long as the weather and the roads demanded. The German plan at the opening of the Ardennes offensive assumed an acoustic truth of modern war: when wires go dead, units fall apart. Assault groups kicked telephone lines out of shallow ditches, demolition teams cut switchboards, and jamming units rode forward to fuzz the ether. Weather helped. Low cloud pinned fighter bombers to drenched airfields and turned the hills around Street Vith into a closed box where sound did not travel far and sightlines were measured in hedgerows. In that box, a panzer battalion that met a mute enemy could split a road junction before the 2nd hour. American forward units did not go mute. They shifted to the architecture that had been drilled since Normandy VHF FM at the small unit and armoured level. Infantry carried man-pack sets slung across shoulders. Tank nets ran in parallel, tied into company and battalion control. The physics mattered. FM gave a clean, narrow voice that did not smear into background static, and the sets used squelch that clipped the air at the end of each transmission, cutting chatter before it could waste seconds. More important than the electronics was the language riding them. Brevity codes and standard calls made strangers interoperable. A rifle company that had never worked with a given tank troop could still trade the correct phrases and build a fire mission in under a minute. Inside a Sherman's turret, this did not read like technology. It read like time saved. The gunner heard short words and numbers and could keep both hands on the handles because no one was telling stories on the net. The loader listened for ammunition type only. The commander split his eye between the sight and the periscope, while his other sense measured the cadence of the radio report acknowledgement correction shift. Nothing about it felt heroic. It felt like a machine that removed friction from the first 3 minutes of contact. Outside the vehicles, the effect was geometry and pressure. A forward observer, dug in behind a fence line, could lock the first 2 rounds, walk the burst with a correction, and have the battery settle into a pattern that fenced off a lane. When the observer said smoke arrived. When he said left 2, the line of bursts stepped, left 2, and the tankers used the grey wall to scoot to a better line. The crucial point is not that any one battery was exceptional. It is that the handoff from eye to gun to track existed without a single copper wire. When weather erased air power from the equation, the ground loop closed itself. German signals intelligence understood that loops exist. That is why intercept teams were out under pine branches with headphones. They sought the break silence after cut lines, babble after surprise, the telltale of headquarters missing. They heard instead a disciplined pulse. Identify. Acquire. Fire. Shift. A roadblock on a grid. A target reference point called twice, then corrected. An engine note rising and settling in the same exact way on 2 separate nets a kilometre apart. Even when a frequency became crowded or suspect, the voices stepped to a sister net and resumed the same tempo within seconds. The jamming was not pointless. It forced shifts and sometimes mangled a syllable. But it did not create the sustained vacuum the plan required. The battalion-level effect of this was that gaps did not widen in a clean way. A company might gain the first 100 meters, but the next bend in the road arrived already under watched airspace, watched here, meaning watched by a man with a handset and a line to guns. If the advance nosed outward to the north, a tank troop on that side was not an isolated trio of vehicles. It was a set of guns plugged into the same voice that had just moved the shell bursts. The attackers still had choices: hug the tree line, hunt the observers, push another company, but the cost was time. In a winter offensive built on ripping tempo from a surprised opponent, time is currency you cannot print. There were limits on the American side. FM did not penetrate every fold cleanly. The hills and forests built pockets where voices thinned. Sets broke operators tired, and green replacements could step on each other's transmissions. German units did more than listen. They triangulated and hunted, and when they caught a node, they killed it. Yet the net's design assumed loss and still survived. Company commanders had multiple sets. Platoons knew alternates. The words themselves were designed to be light, short, repeatable, easy to teach at midnight under a poncho. The discipline that kept nets cold, no tails, no filler, also made them resilient under stress. An hour-long slice from the street Vith sector shows the pattern more clearly than any diagram. First, landlines fail and a local headquarters moves. Second, a panzer element probes the south face of the junction, finds a half-prepared American roadblock and forces it back. Third, the radio loop tightens, an observer calls a mission. Tanks report position changes, smoke goes down. A second observer takes over as the first shifts to a flank. The German company commander hears some of this through his own sets and pushes again, counting on the old script in which artillery is late and voices tie themselves in knots. The fourth step is where the new script lives. Corrected fire lands before his second platoon rounds the bend, and when he tries to pull left, the Shermans that were supposed to be scattered are already talking to the same guns. A few kilometers away north of the Amblève, the same cadence repeats on a different road with different names and a different hedge. That second engagement is vital because it erases the argument of luck. The radios do not make American crews braver, nor do they turn winter roads into dry parade grounds. They compress the interval between seeing and doing, and they make that compression available to units that have never seen each other before this week. German crews and scouts adjusted. They looked for dead ground where observers could not see, tried to outpace the correction cycle, hunted the men with handsets instead of the tanks themselves. Sometimes it worked. Nothing in this field is perfect. But the broader effect remained. The more the attackers forced a decision at a junction, the more often the decision arrived, framed by a net that could not be cut with pliers. A myth held from earlier campaigns that the easiest path to killing American control was to kill its telephones did not fit what the headphones recorded. From inside a turret, the difference between a myth and a change in the physics of survival is measured in breath. 2 slow breaths, then a round, 1 breath, then a correction. The loader's hand learns a new timing. The commander's eye learns that the words on the net are clocks, and that when those clocks keep time, you live long enough to make the next decision. The intercept teams heard that clock through the cold. Snow crusts the fir needles, and the antenna shivers like a thin bone. A German signals scout presses the ear pads tighter until the waxed cloth crackles under his gloves. Breath climbs the scarf and freezes along the stitching. The squelch clicks shut clean hard, and the forest gives back the dull idle of engines somewhere down in the fold of the road. Oil smell rides the cold, edged by cordite and damp wood smoke that refuses to rise. Routine says this should be the quiet hour after lines are cut. He counts heartbeats between transmissions, pencil ready to mark the shape of the enemy net. The headset comes alive with a voice so short it is almost a metronome. Identify. Another voice, same net, 2 words. Roadblock 1. The scout looks up. He mouths the syllables to the corporal beside him. English clipped, no filler. Acquire. A pause that is almost respectful. Fire. Far-off guns answer with a 4-beat rhythm that sets snow dust sliding from the spruce boughs. The pencil draws a tiny square for a tank net, a triangle for infantry, and the line between them that doctrine says should not be there when poles are down. Across the valley, a Sherman commander watches frost creep along the rim of his periscope. On net, roadblock 1, smoke now, words only, no names. His loader pins a gloved thumb to the banded sabot and waits for the syllable that frees the round. The gunner's sight picture steadies, not perfect, never perfect on a winter track, but steady enough to translate breath into steel. The driver eases right to take the pothole on the idler and keep the tube from bouncing. Intercom hums with the thin burr of carbon microphones. No one wastes adjectives. The FO2 hedges back, says rounds out, and the commander hears it as a door opening. The German tank down the lane works its own checklist. Loader palms the case, head smooth, and hot gunner draws a thin inhale to flatten the crosshair. Commander cranes at the periscope slit for the American mistake that is supposed to come now, the wide panic swing that shows a flank. The net in his ears carries words. He expects jamming, orders push left, cut their talk. It also carries something else, the clean LM tone of FM that doesn't smear when the wind shifts or the snow thickens. He says the range. His gunner repeats. The traverse starts. It is heavy today. The ring gear drags through old grease that turned to wax at dawn. The first shells land short, then walk. Shift left 2. A line of grey climbs from the frozen verge and turns the lane to a corridor with a blind wall. Muffled fragments rake the German periscope clear and then louder as a second bracket corrects. The gunner asks for the last figure again because the voice on his net stepped on it. The commander gives it clipped, and the gunner feels the reticle settle. Good picture. He can take it. But the driver sees a shape move in the smoke like a door opening the wrong way, and he curses because the traverse is still behind. Sight picture steady. Send. The Sherman recoils, tracks grab hull squats through a shallow rut the driver chose for exactly that purpose. The spent casing rings and rolls once under the loader's boot. Sabot up. He feels heat under the knuckle where the glove split at the seam. The commander stays low in the cupola, eyes at the glass block, watching the smoke he asked for a minute ago do its work like a tool he can put away later. The signals scout hears none of the metal, only the cadence that explains it. Splash. 2 seconds. Repeat. The pencil stops, then continues, because the pattern belongs on paper observer, to guns, guns to armour, armour to movement, and back to observer. He writes a small note, same voice on 2 nets. No, same rhythm, that is worse. The German tank commander feels the second correction land harder than the first. A shard chips the inside edge of the cupola ring and spits grit down his collar. He calls for reverse to cheat the incoming line. The driver answers late because he is watching the hedge for men with tubes, the real killers inside a town choke. The commander thinks, hold 1 more second for the shot they trained for in summer. The gunner says, hold, hold, and the third pattern of bursts hammers the exit of the alley he meant to use. Across the lane, target burning. It is not triumph, it is data. Shift alley left, watch the flank. The platoon net answers with 2 acknowledgements, One clipped, one stepping on it, both corrected without opinion. Bump right. The driver does half a width enough to recenter the gunner's glass. The loader tastes smoke mixed with the sweet chalk of the hissing candles they popped to cover the last move. He coughs once, swallows and resets his feet, where the deck makes sense for the next recoil. A second engagement unspools north of the bend. Different platoon, same grammar. Illumination. A pause long enough to write the request down. Rounds out. When the parachutes open, the snowfield turns to flat paper and the hedges draw themselves in black lines. The German scout hears the illumination call and writes 2 letters IL. He draws a bracket to the guns. Then he draws the same bracket to a different net and knows it is not a duplicate transmission. It is 2 parts of one body speaking with one accent. The American FO shifts 30 meters to a better slit between trunks. He says splash repeat because the first pattern is good enough to be made better. He adds left 2 and hears the guns accept with the click of a gate. He moves again because he is the most valuable target in this square of ground, and valuable targets deserve to be elsewhere every 90 seconds. He does not think about the tankers he is helping. He thinks about the next correction. He is a hinge, not a witness. German infantry push up with Panzerfausts, and the Shermans lock their corners like animals feeling a hunter enter the brush. The bow gun tracks low patient. The commander calls nothing that is not necessary. Hold low. The driver takes that literally and lays the nose into a frozen rut to keep the silhouette down. Over the intercom, the loader says nothing about the flame he sees. 2 houses over, he waits for the word that makes his hands true. Back under trees, the signals team switches to an alternate frequency because the last one filled with snow and noise. The new net sounds like the same room. Short, cold, sufficient. The corporal mouths the English words he now knows by shape, even without understanding them. He underlines the time between identify and the first report of rounds out, and then between splash and repeat. Under 2 minutes both times. He writes it. He is not excited. He is an accountant counting time. The German tank commander picks a narrow reverse hand flat to the hull to feel the engine note as if the metal will tell him whether the road is clear. He says to watch for the man with the handset, the one who makes the guns walk. His gunner says the sight is blind, now smoke in it like wet cloth. The loader touches his tongue to a cracked lip and tastes iron. He waits for the order that means abandon, and it does not come because the commander still believes the lane exists if he can only get the nose pointed at it. Net clear. The Sherman platoon lead's voice is dry, a tool being put back in a drawer. Switch alternate. Clicks follow the small domestic sounds of electricity obeying. Stand by, fire for effect. The FO says yes without saying the word. On the floor of the turret, the casing bumps the loader's ankle and he moves his boot without looking down. The commander checks the watch he doesn't trust in winter and decides they have held long enough to hand the grid to someone else. Engines idle, then settle, and in that lull the forest grows large again. The scout lifts his headphones by a finger's width to let blood back into the cartilage. No celebration rises from the valley. No speeches arrive on the net. What comes is a routine, a count of ammunition, a short relocation order, a reminder to watch a flank that the last mission uncovered. The corporal traces the shape of the fight with his pencil and finds he has been drawing a machine rather than a conversation. He circles the word unified because it feels like a translation of something he cannot phrase. The Sherman backs 1 vehicle length noses into a fresh angle, and the crew breathes through that reset as if a clock had skipped and then resumed. The commander wipes frost off the glass with a thumb and watches the smoke clear enough to change the picture from grey to shapes. He does not speak about what is burning. He says, "Hold grid, prepare handoff." The gunner flexes the fingers that still hum from recoil. The loader opens his glove and closes it again to feel the tack of powder on his skin. The driver watches the sight line for the man with the tube who will try to make a simple rule out of a complicated fight. The last shell of the mission lands in the distance with the tidy finality of a drawer closing. The net clicks once, twice, and then breathes. Trees lean a fraction under a breeze that finally found its way into the cut. Snow continues to fall in small adjustments, dusting the cable that runs from the German antenna to the headset, where the scout, without thinking, has pressed his ear back into place. He writes his last line: "Clean the enemy keeps their net after lines are cut." Artillery responds in minutes. Armor moves on voice. Pattern repeats. He does not sign it. He tears the page along the crease, hands it up, and watches it disappear into a coat already stiff with cold. The machine across the valley is still speaking in one voice. At First Army Headquarters, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges faced a problem that did not fit on a single map sheet: restore tempo without air, keep junctions alive without wire, and buy days against an armoured thrust measured in hours. The answer was not one order, but a structure already taught and now enforced without compromise. 8th Corps, under Major General Troy Middleton, pushed authority down while tightening language up. Division and combat command leaders: Major General Robert W. Hasbrouck at 7th Armoured Division and Brigadier General Bruce C. Clark at Combat Command B treated radios as the spine, not an accessory. The rule was simple: when landlines die, FM lives, and every minute saved on the net becomes ground held on the road. Standard operating procedure was not invented in the snow. It was carried forward from Normandy and hardened by failures. Brevity codes stripped sentences to bones. A correction to the left lived as a number. Fire discipline moved with the same grammar from a rifle platoon to a battalion fire direction center and out to a battery's guns. Company command posts kept a laminated slip with the net's essentials hung inside a tent flap or the door of a half-track. Tank crews taped cue words inside turrets because words placed correctly would keep them alive longer than extra adjectives. The doctrine was social as much as technical. Do not narrate, do not speculate, and do not repeat what the shell will say for you. Under that language sat the architecture that made one machine more than a metaphor. At the platoon and company layer, infantry carried SCR 300 sets, and armor worked on SCR 508. Intercoms kept crews clean-headed under blast and vibration. Those local nets climbed through company to battalion and crossed to the artillery chain through forward observers who spoke both dialects. The Fire Direction Center converted a human sight picture into gun data and returned a cadence rounds out splash repeat. The same observer, or his relief 2 hedges away, fed the result back to tanks and squads with the identical words. A unit borrowed from another division did not need translation. It plugged into the grammar and functioned at once. That modularity was not decoration. It was how the Americans replaced mass they did not have on a given road with coordination they could carry in packs and hulls. Because the net was the spine, the staff decisions that mattered were those that preserved it under stress. Hodges' headquarters accepted calculated risks that earlier in the war would have looked rash. Forward observers were told to move every 90 to 120 seconds whenever fire concentrated, and maneuver elements were tasked to keep a living corridor. For those observers, smoke on demand, suppressive bursts by clock short, displacements to deny triangulation. Fire direction centers pre-briefed alternate frequencies and were authorized to continue a mission across a frequency shift without waiting for formal reauthentication. Combat commands rehearsed handoff of a grid square. One tank platoon could slide a choke point to a neighbor, and the guns would keep walking shells without a visible seam. Logistics turned those choices from words into endurance. Radios were issued deep spares for companies, spare antennas and batteries in platoon bags, repair sections close enough to fix a broken handset before a field kitchen could heat water. The same was true for guns and hulls. Ammunition arrived by habit. Barrels and breech parts cycled through forward shops. Knocked-out vehicles were cannibalized without ceremony to hold another crew's place in the pattern. Personnel policy aligned with the net replacements were trained to the same speech, so a new radio man or loader did not dilute the grammar. Losses mattered, but the system assumed loss and recovered on a schedule measured in minutes and hours, not weeks. Time drove every claim. In clean conditions, time to fire from a forward observer's first report to rounds out lived under 2 minutes. In dirtier conditions, with a frequency change or local interference, the loop stretched to 3 or 4. Shift orders for armor, once smoke arrived, were expected to complete in 60 to 90 seconds, just long enough to bump into a new firing pocket, never long enough to let an opponent settle a sight. When a set failed or a runner fell the time to recover using alternates and spares, lived under 10 minutes for a company. The rest of the net kept the cadence while the missing voice rejoined. Those numbers were not decorations for a report. They were survival, 2 breaths to splash, 1 breath to repeat, 1 short skid to reset the sight. The tempo showed most clearly in handoff. An observer forced out by fragments would pass the grid to his relief on the alternate net. The fire direction center held the mission number steady. The guns continued to walk down the alley while the tank commander heard the same voice return with a different mouth. At a junction-like street, Vith, where Combat Command B kept the town alive by inches, that continuity meant the choke points behaved like valves, not brakes. Pressure bled where the Americans chose to open and sealed where they chose to shut. Why not copy it? German units listened. General Hasso von Manteuffels' spearheads had signals detachments that could intercept, triangulate, and sometimes jam. Yet 3 obstacles remained. The first was replacement veteran crews, skilled observers, and quality sets were not assets the German army could regenerate in December 1944. Every loss hollowed a capability that had taken years to teach. The second was uneven standardization frequencies. Set types and net discipline varied across formations. A battalion that worked cleanly one day might step on its own tail the next, and language rules differed from unit to unit. The third was strategic opportunity cost, rare tanks, scarce fuel, and the last competent air crews could not be risked in urban or hedgerow experiments, whose payoff arrived only if measured by procedures rather than single kills. Even when German operators copied the cadence, their side could not field a pipeline that turned voice into guns, into tracks with the same reliability across multiple corps on short notice. The American system had constraints of its own. FM folded in hills, batteries died, antennas snapped in cold, green operators could clog a net, jamming sometimes forced clumsy hops, but training spares and discipline lowered the recovery time. The net was built with failure in mind, extra paths, brief words, and a social contract that punished storytelling. When an element fell out, the rest carried on without energy draining into argument. That property functioning while damaged marks a real doctrine and not a diagram. Industry made the doctrine sustainable, but did not substitute for it. It was true that Detroit could send another set, another truck, another barrel. The more important truth was that the replacement slid into a frame that expected it and knew how to use it immediately. The operator did not invent his role. He adopted a role defined by a few binding words. The tank commander did not create a local dialect. He spoke into a grammar that did not care about his accent. That is why the machine looked unified from the outside, because the parts were interchangeable at the level of instruction long before they met on a frozen road. On the attacker's clock, the operational result was cumulative. A panzer thrust that counted on minutes of vacuum after cutting wires instead found a living net. A company that gambled on confusion at a junction instead met a valve that closed on schedule. Weather suppressed aircraft, but the ground battle closed its own loop observer to guns to maneuver and back again. Attrition still hurt. Crews still died. Junctions still bent under weight. The difference was that the American pattern absorbed shock without losing tone, while the German plan relied on shocks becoming breaks. The shift from field expedient to doctrine is visible in the tone of after-action notes. Company posts wrote radio first for urban and hedgerow work. Battalions drilled switch alternate before entering a choke. Fire direction centers recorded time to first rounds out as a metric of competence. Words turned into tables, tables into habits, habits into reflex. The system did not need to be celebrated to be feared. It needed to keep time. From a German listening post, that timing felt like an admission that an old lever no longer worked. Cutting wires did not cut nerves. Jamming did not create silence long enough for steel to pass through. The Americans had begun to fight like an assembly line. Voice becomes data, data becomes fire, fire becomes movement, movement creates a new observation, and the cycle stays inside minutes, until the road is no longer a road. The defenders were not stronger because they shouted louder. They were stronger because they did not have to shout at all. The wires were cut. The voice remained. The myth was clean and persuasive, cut the wires, and the American head goes quiet. In the first winter days, that story felt true enough to plan around. Assault groups yanked field cables from the ditches, jammers rasped across the bands, command posts relocated under shell fire. The expected vacuum should have followed voices, tangling schedules, slipping junctions, cracking open before artillery could be found. What arrived instead was a loop that kept time under damage. On the ground, the breakpoint was measurable. After wire cuts forward, observers still produced a first rounds out in under 2 to 4 minutes. When fragments found one observer a second, took the mission number on the alternate net without ceremony, and the guns continued to walk. Tank platoons shifted positions after smoke in 60 to 90 seconds, enough to change angle before an attacker could settle a reticle. A thrust that depended on minutes of silence found an opponent whose silence came only after the work was done. German scouts recorded what they heard with the economy of accountants. 2 nets, same cadence 5 to 10 minutes apart, not an echo, but a repetition, the same grammar applied at a different bend in the road. The notes that went backward did not praise American gear. They admitted an absent condition the long gap did not happen. A panzer company commander who expected chatter and delay found a junction that behaved like a valve, opening and closing by schedule, indifferent to cut poles. The words were not victory cries. They were short: identify, acquire fire shift. When jamming pushed a net off channel, the voices stepped sideways and resumed the tempo before the enemy's second platoon reached the hedge. 2 layers collapsed at once. Tactically, the ground loop observer, fire direction, batteries, tanks, squads closed without the sky. Weather could hold fighter bombers on wet runways all day, and the exchange would still run a sight picture converted to fire in minutes movement, ordered by the same voice. A new sight picture, at a new angle. At the level of documents, the change appeared as a tone in after-action notes, radio first for hedgerow and town time to fire as a measure of competence, switch alternate drilled before entering a choke. Terms that used to be expedients became defaults. The longer the offensive ran, the more the defaults hardened. A German sentence survives in many forms, and says the same thing in all of them. We did not create a long silence. They continued to fire to the same rhythm. That rhythm changed behavior. Panzer elements turned from hunting tanks in alleys to hunting the men with handsets behind fences. Daylight pushes into narrow streets gave way to waits for deeper fog or night. The calculus tilted toward preservation, rare vehicles, scarce fuel crews, whose experience could not be replaced in December because a duel in a choke point did not promise a clean decision. The Americans were not meeting duels. They were dissolving them with procedure. On the American side, fear became drill. Entering a choke meant preloaded alternates, and a silent promise between companies. If one net is jammed, the other waits with the same words. Observers moved every 1.5 to 2 minutes when the fragments came too close, and tanks counted on that motion as part of their own survival. Smoke now was not a tactic. It was a clock tick. Left 2 was not advice. It was a lever. The voice did not comment on results. It kept time for the next act. A short case makes the pattern hard to deny. A German spearhead reaches a T-junction where the local telephone grid is already dead. The first American observer establishes a mission, then shifts out under splinters. The second takes the number the battery, does not stop the alley the attacker needs to exit, begins to close. Tanks use the smoke to ratchet sideways into a pocket that makes their sight picture steady. The second company in the thrust arrives to an angle that no longer exists. At the same hour, a ridge-away illumination descends over a snowfield, and a different platoon speaks the same grammar. The scout in the trees writes it down because it is safer than arguing. What comes next is not triumph but subtraction. Before cut the wires, create a long, quiet harvest the pieces. After cut the wires, force a frequency change, meet the same voice. Before speed magnifies advantage because response times are slow and uneven. After response times stabilize inside minutes across units that have never met. Speed buys less than the costs paid to achieve it. The lever loses purchase when the hinge refuses to loosen. Copying the hinge was not a matter of buying sets. It required standard language low in the structure replacements who arrived speaking it, and commanders willing to accept that control should sound impersonal. The German army in this window could imitate parts, intercept teams, triangulation, local jamming, but could not field a pipeline that rendered voice into fire, into movement at scale across multiple corps in short time. Losses that the American system absorbed as tempo, dents an observer down a handset, broken landed as permanent holes when replacement crews, batteries and radios were not waiting in depth. The sensory frame shrank with the myth. A street duels drama thinned into metrics, 2 breaths to splash, 1 to repeat, 1 short skid to reset. The junction that was supposed to crack behaved like a valve. The scouts, who were supposed to hear panic, instead heard an instrument keeping time under stress. Trees held snow, engines idled in cover. The radio net went quiet not because it failed, but because the task was complete. That was the last day. Cut the wires meant cut the head. By the last days of December, the valley between Vith and the Amblève felt less like a battlefield than a schedule. The weather still held the sky shut, but the ground loop voice to guns to movement kept its own hours. Units that would have spoken to each other only on a telephone learned to meet on FM first, and the habit hardened. Company posts taped brevity slips to doors. Fire direction centers logged time to fire as a performance line. Before a platoon entered a choke, the alternate frequency was agreed, checked, and forgotten until it mattered. Immediate effects showed up as minutes saved. Forward observers moved every 90 to 120 seconds when fragments climbed the berm. The mission number stayed, the guns kept walking. Smoke on request arrived as a tick, not a plea. Tank platoons shifted pockets in 60 to 90 seconds and treated the drift as reflex rather than a maneuver. When a handset failed or an operator went down, recovery lived inside 5 to 10 minutes at company scale. The rest of the net did not sag while the missing voice rejoined. Fatigue remained, losses remained, but the cadence no longer broke with them. On the German side, behavior bent toward preservation. Daylight pushes into tight alleys thinned. Patrols went hunting for the men with handsets rather than the tanks their words moved. Fog and night became prerequisites for risk. Signal detachments kept intercepting, kept jamming, and kept reporting the same absence. The long silence never arrived. A cut pole produced a frequency hop. A jammed channel produced a sidestep. The voice came back with the same grammar. 2 small frames fixed the pattern. In Vith, a forward observer established a mission from a low wall, shifted out under splinters and handed the grid to a relief, who spoke before the smoke cleared. The guns did not pause. The alley the attackers needed began to close. 2 Shermans ratcheted sideways in under a minute and a half, and the second company of the thrust met an angle that no longer existed. North of the Amblève, illumination parachutes flattened a snowfield into paper. A different platoon used the same words, the same corrections, and the same shift order to fence a bend. Different units, identical rhythm. The legacy in the days that followed was procedural rather than heroic. Radio first for town and hedgerow became default. Switch alternate was rehearsed before a column reached houses. Time to fire under 2 minutes in clean nets, and 2 to 4 across. A frequency change served as a standard to be met. The silence after a mission was not relief. It was the absence of waste. Junctions behaved like valves instead of fractures, opening and closing on schedule long enough for corps to move reserves into place and keep the road network from becoming the attacker's straight line. Questions remain and are worth arguing. If this unified voice had been drilled 6 months earlier, does the December thrust lose its speed on day 1? Is a mediocre machine inside a disciplined net more decisive than an excellent machine acting alone? Next, we follow the grammar. Upward, when the ground voice meets the air voice, and the sky opens again. The wires were cut, the voice remained.